Hi, I'm David Witwer, and I'm the president of the Pennsylvania Historical Association. And I'd like to welcome you to a webinar which will focus on this summer's special issue from the journal Pennsylvania History, the issue entitled Exploring Disability History in Pennsylvania. The participants in this webinar are going to offer you a behind-the-scenes perspective on this special issue from our journal. So I'll start by introducing the participants, and then I will turn it over to them to offer their different perspectives. So today's participants include the following: Linda Ries, who is a retired archivist with the Pennsylvania State Archives and is the editor of the journal Pennsylvania History. Also with us today is Dr. Dennis Downey, who is a professor emeritus of history at Millersville University. He is also an author and a disability advocate. And with Jim Conroy, he co-edited a collection entitled Pennhurst and the Struggle for Disability Rights, which is recently published by Penn State University Press in 2020. His current project is entitled In Terror's Shadow: Roland Johnson, Institutionalization, and the Drama of Disability Rights. He is also a past president of the Pennsylvania Historical Association. Also along with us today is Dr. Elliot Simon, who is a licensed psychologist and vice president of the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance. He is author, along with Brent Ruswick, of Hellbound Train: The Beginning of the Pennsylvania State Institutional System for People with Intellectual Disabilities. And he's also author, along with Chelsea Chamberlain, of the Elwyn Archives and Museum, both of which appeared in this issue. And finally, Tyler Stump is an appraisal and acquisitions archivist at the Pennsylvania State Archives, and he specializes in records created by Pennsylvania's state government. So the way it will work is that we will hear from each of these participants, beginning with Linda Ries, who will talk about how this special issue came to be. And then the subsequent participants will talk about their perspectives on disability rights scholarship in Pennsylvania history, and also their component parts in this journal. With no further ado, I will now shut up and turn over the proceedings to the actual important people in this affair. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone, and thank you all for participating. I am very excited and very proud, of which we should all be, of this special issue of Pennsylvania history. And I will back up and say that Pennsylvania history, the complete title is Pennsylvania History, a Journal of Mid-Atlantic Studies. It's the official scholarly journal of the Pennsylvania Historical Association. And 2023 begins our 90th year of publishing the journal. So we've come a long way. And I am, again, especially proud of this particular issue. Dennis Downey and I have been talking about it for, it seems to me, about 4 or 5 years. They did a presentation at the annual conference of the Pennsylvania Historical Association. I think it's like 4 or 5 years ago, but I think you've done at least a couple at the annual meeting. And we have been talking about doing a special issue on the history of disability issues in Pennsylvania. And Dennis agreed to be the guest editor for the issue, and the guest editor is charged with wrangling the authors, if you will. And he did not disappoint. He came up with, I believe, 13 authors who contributed wonderful, powerful articles, essays for this special issue. So I thank Dennis for his commitment to this, and I thank all of the authors again for contributing such wonderful articles. It is an important history that has been under-researched, and I think this special issue kind of opens the door for other states, perhaps, to do similar research and similar presentations on their particular situations, challenges for the history of people with intellectual disabilities. And at this point, I want to hand it over to Dennis Downey, our wonderful guest editor for the issue. Hi, Dennis.
Good morning, Linda, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for the kind words, and I have to say that this would not have happened without Linda Ries and also our fellow contributors. Linda really did yeoman service, not just as the editor of the journal, but sort of picked up the slack for me when I had a little health incident. And so she kept the train moving, to borrow from Elliott's title, and until I was back in action. So thank you to Linda, and thank you to everybody. The intention behind this issue is to illustrate the possibilities of research and also resources in what we can loosely call disability history in Pennsylvania. And the deeper that you go into this topic, the more you realize what is available for research and also what is available in terms of resources. And that Pennsylvania, in many respects, was ground zero, not only for the exclusion of people from with disabilities from mainstream social, cultural, and economic life, but it was also part of that movement for the restoration of rights, especially from the 1960s on, in a series of seminal Supreme Court and federal court decisions, which dismantled institutionalization, dismantled peonage, and other forms of oppression. So Pennsylvania becomes an object lesson. And I think that that was the intent behind this issue, to give encouragement, to demonstrate, in some respects, however incomplete, the rich possibilities for future work, and maybe, if we're lucky, redefine and redirect Pennsylvania and regional and national history by being a more inclusive and complete narrative of what is significant in the past. The journal itself has three major sections. They include a roundtable discussion, which both Tyler and I were a part of at last year's PHA conference that has been reproduced for this issue. It includes a series of scholarly articles. Elliot has written an exceptional article with Brent Ruswig, and it also includes a series of briefer statements about resources and the rich archival holdings that create enormous possibilities for scholars and for the general public. My own sense is that this is a prime example of history as something that happens to people, and that people, human beings, are the subject of history. And this opens up a new door for our consideration of what that means in Pennsylvania and also in Mid-Atlantic studies. One final thought: I am acutely aware of what is not in this issue. This is meant to be suggestive. It is not comprehensive. And there are very significant topics which, for reasons of space, we just couldn't include. As Linda said, we have more than a dozen contributors in all kinds of components. But there are other areas to be explored, and I encourage scholars to do that. And it is all in an effort to write history in the public interest. And to that end, I'd like to introduce both Elliott Simon and Tyler Stump, who are archivists and historians themselves, and not only manage and work with collections, but they write history, and they have made important contributions in the field in this issue. And so I would invite you, each of them, to say something about themselves and what they have contributed in this issue. And maybe Elliot, since you are part of the research component, if you could go first, and then Tyler, who has not only written solid institutional history, but also manages collections for the Pennsylvania State Archives. Maybe follow up, and that'll lead us to a general discussion.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. And I'm very flattered that you've called me a historian and an archivist, because I still don't necessarily consider myself one, but I'm very flattered to be called that. The reason I don't consider myself one is I'm really a licensed psychologist who has worked at Elwyn in a variety of different jobs, finally become an executive director at Elwyn, and I was there since the 1980s. Elwyn has always had a large archives, and over the years, Elwyn is the first facility school for children and adults with intellectual disability in Pennsylvania. So it's, depending how you count, the fourth in the nation. And one of the things that I guess we became known for is we've never thrown anything out. So our archives were there for a long time, and over the years it kind of became more of a curiosity than a place for serious historical research and analysis. But about 15 years ago, maybe now 10 years ago, I got paid a visit by two of the people on the cover of this issue, Greg Pierman and Jim Conroy. I knew them both, and they knew of our archive holdings. Didn't really know the extent of it. And through them, I actually met Charles Hardy, who is a retired professor at Westchester University, Dennis Downey, as well as Brent Ruswick, and a few other real historians who kind of showed me that the history of disability world and the history world was actually interested in the holdings that we had. I mean, I was interested in them more as from an Elwyn history perspective, but the fact that they had much larger use to the history community was great to hear. So with that, I felt kind of, able to open up the archives to historical researchers and to collaborate with them on research. So the archives, as is detailed in the one article in there about Elwyn's holdings, is very vast, very significant, dates back to the 1850s with the beginnings of schools for intellectual disability, and two superintendents there, Curlin and Barr, were really at the forefront of systematizing intellectual disability in the country and the world, really. The institutional model that Curlin kind of called an asylum village really got its toehold at Elwyn and was then replicated across the country, as the one article details about Hellbound Train. And the first thing that Dr. Ruswick and I did actually was publish a paper. There are 6,000 pre-admission blanks at Elwyn in their archives that date from the 1870s through the 1920s. So we published a work, and that was really my first publication in the world of history on those pre-admissions. What did the families expect for their children when they were admitted to Elwyn? How did the administrators and the clinicians look at the children? And Brent was, of course, very valuable in showing how that fit into the historical zeitgeist of the time or whatever, which was certainly not my expertise. But from that time, I was able to hook up internships with both Millersville under Dennis's supervision, as well as Westchester under Charles Hardy's supervision. And the interns got into the archives, and they're really the ones who were able to systematize it. They developed finding aids. I have pictures of the archives before they got in there, and it was just a mass of boxes, without any real structure to it. But there's now a significant structure there, and it's easier to do research. I should also mention that the archives are now undergoing a major renovation and are actually closed to research, as Elwyn is actually putting some resources into getting a separate facility for it, and to kind of make it go online. But so we have some grants in the works for getting some funding to do that as well. With all that, I met a person by the name of Dana Olson, who some of you may know, and he was a retired state employee who I also knew, and he was interested in Polk Center, which is the first state center in Pennsylvania. And I knew that it started with 153 people from Elwyn. And the political intrigue of that, as I got into Barr's correspondence and Curlin's correspondence in the archives, became fascinating. And a lot of that is detailed in the in that Hellbound Train article.
May I just interrupt for a second to
Sure.
say that Elwyn is outside of Philadelphia and Polk is north of Pittsburgh, just so viewers can have a sense as to the geographic spread of the two institutions.
Sure, and the reason for that, of course, is because Elwyn was in the East first. And Elwyn, as happens, was becoming too crowded back in those days. And Curlin had a very specific idea of how many people should be there, and what the kind of mix of the people should be with regard to functioning level for his model to work. So he was lobbying for a long time for an Elwyn in the West. But because of pressure, the state of Pennsylvania was forced to open their own state institution, and in that sense was very late to the state institution business in 1897, where many other states had opened it first. But because Elwyn was there and served that purpose early on. But as I got into that research, and it started really probably 10 years ago, looking at this, we were able, through Dana really, to send a couple of interns to Polk, because at that point, I knew that 153 people left Elwyn and went to Polk on a train. I didn't know who they were, because Elwyn's archives did not denote them in any way. I would have had to look through thousands of records to see, okay, this person went to Polk in 1897. So when Dana got the opportunity to go to Polk, he and I went there. And as I walked into Polk, the superintendent there said, oh, you know that Polk started with 153 people from Elwyn. I said, yeah, but I don't know who they were. Do you? She said, oh yeah, here's our first admissions book, and there were the names of the 153 people. And it was like, that moment that you really want to have, I guess, as a researcher, which is, oh wow, now I can really find out who these were, because that's really the really great part of that article for me, is finding out who these people are. I mean, the administrative history and the institutional histories have kind of been out there, but the actual people who got on that train and left Elwyn to go to Polk, really nobody knew who they were, and they weren't examined at all. So that was very, very helpful to looking into that. So when I got back to Elwyn, I had a intern from Westchester look up these 153 people, and we found about 135 of them, their records at Elwyn, their initial Elwyn records. One of the things I didn't do in presenting the article was put pictures of them, so I wanted to just take a minute or two to show some of these folks. And this this girl here, I don't know, can you see that picture of the girl yet?
No.
Let's see. Here we go. Maybe. Do you see her now? Okay, that's Ella, who is mentioned in the article. She and her brother and sister left Elwyn for Polk, and were involved in one of the more intriguing aspects of that article, which was the sister and another resident who came to Polk fell in love, and the male escaped Polk, and there's a long involved story there of trying to get her out because he wanted to marry her, which never actually happened. But that was her sister. This is Ella, who was the older sister and left Elwyn and remained at Polk until 1918, and she became a very integral part of Polk's running. And I'm into colorization of things, which I don't know if this is working at the moment, but this is a let me see if I can get her back on there. There you go. There she is in her dress that I just put on her to kind of bring her more to life. But this is another person. This is Minnie, who, as far as I can tell, is the first African-American resident of a state intellectual disability center. She left Elwyn on that same train, became a hard-working, according to her Polk records, member of the, again, domestic workforce at Polk, of course, all for unpaid labor at the time. She passed away at Polk in 1904 from tuberculosis, and several of the people that left did. This is Joseph, another person in the article who passed away also from tuberculosis in 1900. And finally, Sam, who, like a few of the people, surprising to me actually, were discharged from Polk and went on to be members of society or with their families and did well. And that's Sam. So they are, you know, to me, these folks are the real story. And the more that we can get their stories out there and show how this train that left Elwyn really did continue to run on the tracks, metaphorically, and turn into a really oppressive system that kept people out of society who clearly could have been there, I think is important. So that's where I'll stop now, I guess. And I'll turn it over to Tyler.
All right, thanks, Elliot. So yeah, my name is Tyler Stump, and I am an archivist at the Pennsylvania State Archives. And the piece that I contributed to this special issue was called Records and Resources, Finding the History of Disability and Institutionalization at the Pennsylvania State Archives. And so if anybody is interested in doing any kind of history or looking into the history of any institution that operated in Pennsylvania, whether it's one that was a center for people with intellectual disabilities or other ones that were typically called state hospitals for the insane, the Pennsylvania State Archives is probably one of the best resources, definitely the largest collection of records related to that. And so this article is kind of a guide to where do you start, or just giving you kind of the lay of the land for that. And so how this article came about, and I assume why Dennis asked me to write this article, in the last maybe 10, 15 years or so, the Pennsylvania State Archives has been collecting records from Pennsylvania state institutions incredibly, I would say, aggressively. So we've been really going out in the field and seeing what still exists at these institutions or other places. And it's all across the state in all sorts of nooks and crannies, but we're finding what is out there, making sure we're kind of looking at the records and bringing stuff back to Harrisburg, to the state archives, where we have it in one centralized place. And we've brought in several hundred cubic feet of records from more than a dozen state hospitals and centers just in the last 5 or 6 years alone since I've been here at the archives. And so it's really transformed what we have available for research and what the kind of potential for different research projects is. And so as one of the archivists who really was kind of the boots on the ground, I was the one going out to these different facilities, digging through basements and attics and closets and anywhere else where records were stored and pulling things out and bringing them back to Harrisburg. I really got a better sense than most folks, I think, of what records actually exist and what is in them. And so I kind of had a really good personal perspective on that and just seeing what their potential was for research. And we've had a lot of success in the last couple of years with the genealogical community, with folks who are doing family history and genealogical research, who word kind of has spread in their community about what resources we have and what new things are available. And so we've gotten a large influx of people who are doing family history, and that's been great. But we haven't had as many folks from kind of the academic or scholarly research community. And that's something that we've been desperately trying to change. I mean, we want as many researchers coming in and looking at these records as is possible. I'd love to see a full research room every day with this stuff. And so this article was kind of one, kind of a lay of the land, but two, just a desperate cry to tell everybody who's interested in this topic, and not just in Pennsylvania disability history and institutionalization specifically, but just anyone interested in the field in general, because I think you can kind of extrapolate a lot of what was going on in Pennsylvania to other trends that are going on in the United States and kind of more broadly. But just, yeah, kind of a plea for anybody to come in and get their hands on these records as well. And I think especially in the past, the state archives more focused on collecting kind of like the basic administrative and kind of bigger picture records. So things like annual reports, Board of Trustees minutes, correspondence from superintendent. But in more recent years, kind of with an eye to what Dennis and other, and Elliot and other scholars have been looking at and kind of what information has been useful for their research, we've really been focusing on the records that document individual people and their experiences. So those would be things like patient case files, admission records and discharge records, correspondence from family members who are writing to an institution inquiring about a family member, or sometimes to the governor or somebody else who worked in Harrisburg saying, hey, I'm asking about conditions in this one, in Harrisburg State Hospital or Polk Center or somewhere else like that. So just a wide variety of things like that, but ones that kind of are centered on individual experiences, which I think is a really good or a really important shift in what our collecting priorities have been. So of course, when Dennis reached out to me to write this article, it kind of checked a lot of boxes off for what I thought was important. So I jumped on it immediately. A lot of what I wrote, so kind of just saying what's at the state archives, how is it organized, where can you find different pieces of information. A lot of it was guided by the appraisal notes that I wrote as I was traveling around the state, visiting different institutions, looking at their records and bringing them back to Harrisburg to the state archives, but also with researchers who have come in. So what records are they using? What sort of things are they asking me for that we didn't have? And some of them, the records just don't exist, but other times, they didn't exist for a particular institution, but we found them in another place or something like that, or a variety of other things like that. And also just my own experience doing research in these types of records. A few issues of Pennsylvania history ago, I wrote an article on Farview State Hospital, which was the state's institution for the, quote, criminally insane, which operated throughout most of the 20th century. And that was inspired by, I went out to Farview State Hospital, which is now a state prison up in Northeast Pennsylvania, maybe about 20 miles northeast of Scranton. And we did collect a lot of great records from there. And so we brought them back to the archives, and I started working on this article because I thought the history of the institution was really important. But as I was working on it, I found a lot of the history wasn't just in the institutional records. It was in other places. It was in governor's papers where you have, citizens correspondence coming in or constituent correspondence. It was in audits and annual reports that came from various departments across the Commonwealth. It came from drafts of bills that the legislature wrote, other things like that. So the more I looked into it, the more I found that the records are really spread throughout a lot of different places. And I think that's a good segue to why I think the article I wrote, like kind of what its importance is, I think, for anyone who's interested in doing this kind of history, and not just at the state archives, but I'd say any archive in Pennsylvania and beyond that has records related to disability and institutionalization. It's that I think just having a roadmap is helpful because things might not just be where you expect them to be. There's not just going to be a box that says, oh, here's the state hospital records. Most records in archives are organized by their office of origin, or kind of the way they were originally organized, or who created them. And lots of people were interested or involved in disability policy, institutionalization, those sorts of things. So they're going to be spread throughout a lot of different places. So you take Pennhurst State School and Hospital, for instance. We have records that were created by the institution itself. And so we have a great kind of distinct things that were created by Pennhurst at the archives. But we also have things that come from, the Department of Public Welfare's main offices in Harrisburg, where they are monitoring the institution and writing about it and investigating it. We have records from the Attorney General, from the Governor's office, who are investigating it as well at different points in time. We have records from the Department of Justice that are related to Pennhurst, records from the Department of General Services, who built the buildings themselves, and lots of other offices and bureaus from within those different departments as well. And so just thinking about how do I do research, or where do I start? The Pennsylvania State Archives has over 1,000 cubic feet of records from all these different places and offices. And so I think the article that I wrote, and just kind of what I was thinking about when I wrote it, was giving you a sense of where do I start and what are the things along the way that are worth looking into that you might not notice firsthand, because it's a little overwhelming, I think. So maybe I'll stop there with kind of what the article is. I'd encourage you to read it if you haven't already. But just that's kind of where it came from, and why I think it's important to have some sort of guide when you're starting this research, because I've seen a lot of folks who come in and they see the bulk of what we have, and then your eyes kind of bulge out a little bit, and you're like, how am I going to do anything with this? How will I find any information? And so I'm here just to say you can find what you're looking for. It might not be where you expect, but it's here and it's open for research. And so I hope you will come and see it.
Well, thank you both. Let me quickly pitch a couple questions and do it in this context. In working on the book Pennhurst and the Struggle for Disability Rights with Jim Conroy, we interviewed quite a lot of people, some of whom wanted to be identified, some of whom did not. We interviewed state policemen who actually participated in investigations, certainly some of the residents. And it strikes me in listening to both of you that we have an issue of voice, and the paper trail only goes so far, and both of you alluded to this in trying to define the parameters of this kind of history. How have you, knowing that you're, for both Elwyn and the State Archives, your holdings are expanding considerably. How have you used those records to try to recover the voice of people who actually lived the experience of disability or lived in an institution of some kind? And there are 60-some institutions across the state in the 1920s. How do you recover the voice? Mary Schreiner wrote a piece for the journal, and she was a summer scholar for the PHMC, and she approached it one way. Have you any thoughts about how you use these materials to actually not just cover the institutional history, but the identity and voice of the people that are, existed behind these paper trails?
I mean, I can start. It's as Dennis is, want, he has picked up on a very difficult aspect of this research, because a lot of the people's own voice is not there. So you have second and third hand descriptions of the people. specifically at Elwyn, there's, you know, a medical record book for each individual. And I'm speaking now for our archival records, of course, that are from like 1850 to say the 1920s. You know, to find the individual's voice there, whenever you come across a letter written by an individual who was there, and they are there, you know, that's the best. You know, so a first person account of what living in an institution back then was like is the best way to do it. And there are some of those, but very, very few compared to the overwhelming amount of medical and administrative records and speaking. So the way you try and do it, and Chelsea Chamberlain, who I mentioned, did her dissertation in the Elwyn archives at Penn, and she gets at that with her work in looking at the dynamic between Elwyn's administration and the people who lived there. And she did that by going through all of Barr's correspondence and comparing it to the individual's records. And you know, occasionally you can find first-person accounts, which is the best. But what you're mainly looking at is second person, you know, descriptions or administrative, you know, records. I know what you think, Tyler.
Yeah, I would say it's similar where, Dennis, like you talked about with limitations on the records that we have. The Pennsylvania State Archives is a government repository. So we primarily are collecting records that are created by state government, by the employees of a particular state hospital or center, the administrators, the physicians, the staff, that sort of thing. And so the bulk of it is written about the individuals and not by them. And I think Mary and other people who have come in and used the archives that we have here have done a great job kind of reading between the lines. So they're finding, okay, here's the kind of the administrator or the official account of an individual and the nature of their admission or their experiences while they were at the institution, maybe just reading through a case file and seeing, okay, they worked in the laundry, or they did something here, or they ran away at this point or something like that, and then kind of crafting that narrative and then kind of how can we understand their experience through that. I think also at the State Archives, kind of like Elliot mentioned, we do have records that are created by individuals who were institutionalized or who experienced institutionalization, but they're not going to jump at you in a finding aid. You might have to look in the Secretary of Public Welfare's correspondence, like received correspondence, and that's where you're going to find a letter from a mother who's inquiring about her son who was at Polk in 1965 or something like that. Because we do have that. There isn't going to just be a folder that says, letters from parents or something like that. It's just the things that we have. It's how the creators organize things. And I think a lot of times institutions weren't really prioritizing the voices of individuals and people, members of the disability community specifically. These records were created so that they could operate an institution, so that they could, do whatever they needed to do with the records, whether it was balancing their budget or, providing for policy or just, facility operations or something like that. So I think you have to keep in mind why people create these records and what function they served. And then kind of from there, you can go on and find things, hopefully, and think about, okay, well, who would have documented the individual experience and why would they have done that? And then why would they have kept that? And that might help you find what you're looking for. But I would also be remiss if I didn't say there are other institutions in Pennsylvania that are doing a great job collecting records that document individual experiences, whether it's institutionalization or just disability kind of writ large. The Heinz History Center and the Consortium for the Western Pennsylvania Consortium for Disability History. They have a long title, which I always kind of butcher it, but they're doing great work in the western part of the state. And that's, these are organizations that are working with the disability community and documenting from them directly. I know the Arc of Pennsylvania has started archiving their own organizational papers, which has a lot of great stuff, kind of from the advocacy community who has had a hand in either reforming or closing a lot of different state centers, famously Pennhurst, but also Western Center and a variety of other places in the state. So there are other repositories too. And so I think, with Elwyn, with the state archives, we are one resource, but we are definitely not the only one. And I would never tell any researcher, just go to one archive and you're done. I think that the story is a lot bigger than that, but we're definitely a place, both of our institutions, I think, we're a place to start this conversation or to start the research, but definitely not the only one.
Yeah, I could also should add to that one way that I've done it is to pick an individual. And it's almost like you're pulling on a string and all this stuff starts to fall into place. In the first paper I did with Brent, we talked about Bill. And as we got more into Bill, we came to understand Bill better because with the internet now, you can look up a lot about people. I mean, Bill left Elwyn after being there for about 1.5 years, became a trained electrician in Washington, D.C., was part of the major Christmas lights exhibition every year in Washington, D.C. Started, so all these kinds of things you can learn about the person if you pick and really delve into them. At Elwyn, there's a lot of pictures of people, which can certainly tell you a lot. And there's also things that they did, that they made. So, Elwyn was very involved in woodworking and stonemasonry. And if you look at the walls at Elwyn, you'll see on a lot of these walls that are all over the campus, J. Rodis, R-O-D-I-S. Well, he was a person who lived there who was a trained mason, and he built a lot of the walls at Elwyn. So let's look at J. Rodis's life and kind of delve into him and make him come alive, which is really, I think, the key there.
Mm-hmm. And you, Elliot, Elwyn has acquired the Vineland papers, mm-hmm. which will greatly expand in time what you can offer the public in terms of research. I think Tyler's archives is continuing to grow. Readers in the summer issue will find a very detailed article about Temple and what they've acquired and a number of other organizations. So I think that this becomes a useful guide about how to begin and where to begin and what sort of resources you will find. And my last observation, it's always tough to cut me off, but my last observation is that in the summer issue, readers will find not just a narrow portal to the past, but also indications of how issues related to disability history, disability rights continue to the present day, such things as employment and residential housing and so on and so forth. So this is a very dynamic history, and we just give a kind of impressionistic, fairly detailed, but impressionistic view as to not only where this came from in Pennsylvania, but what the current issues are today. And particularly for folks interested in advocacy, the summer issue can be a helpful primer, not only to the past, but also to the present. Let me ask a final question of both of you. Since you are both immersed in the resources and also in the doing of history, how has this changed? What potential is there in the study of disability history, disability rights in Pennsylvania? What potential is there to redefine the very the sense of what we see as significant about Pennsylvania and its past and present moment. How does this redefine our approach to doing Commonwealth history in a broader context?
It's an interesting question. I'm crafting an answer.
Well, may I add that this is something, as I said earlier, this is the tip of the iceberg, and it's a very under-researched area of Pennsylvania history. And what we've done here with this issue is to make people notice, look, there's this whole population that deserves recognition and study. And it's important. It's very important.
Yeah. And I think it's one of the reasons why I work with historians, with real historians. As a psychologist, that's a part of my training that I wish I had, but there's certainly historians now, and I can go back to when I first started at Elwyn, when from my perspective, nobody really in the history community cared much about disability history, and even less about intellectual disability history. And now it seems to me, from my vantage point, that disability history is a hot topic across the United States. People are very interested in it. And people are now also very interested in intellectual disability history. So as the history of disability is being written now, intellectual disability, from my vantage point, which is what I look into, it needs a seat at that table. And as the history is being written, it's incumbent on us to have a seat at that table. And it promotes cross-disciplinary collaboration, in order to pull this off. So to do it right, you need cooperation among typically a university history department, a historian, a facility or an entity like the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and researchers in a variety of fields, because disability doesn't know any boundaries. So there's medical issues to it, there's psychological issues to it, and the history of all that, I think, promotes cross-discipline approach. So I think you need that for it to work. My work would not have happened if I didn't have university affiliations going in there. That said, Pennsylvania, is at the forefront of a lot of disability, as Dennis said, law, as well as firsts, in the nation, and some of those are great things, and some of them are dirty laundry, that needs to be exposed. The whole eugenics part of disability, Pennsylvania for intellectual disability was really, and Vineland, New Jersey, which Elwyn also has their archives, were ground zero for that. So Pennsylvania's place in the field, I think now is the time, because it seems to be more interested in it now than in the 40 plus years that I've been in intellectual disability.
Yeah, I guess I would say right now there's also a good opportunity for this kind of scholarship and this look into this institutionalization history and things like that to have a real impact on policy and just future, I guess maybe not just government interaction, but just the way that the disability community is existing, not just in Pennsylvania, but more broadly in the United States. I know Massachusetts just earlier this year created a new commission to study the history of state hospitals and institutionalization in that state, and just to see what the state's role was in that. And I'd love to see that in Pennsylvania as well. But I think Pennsylvania, across all the different archives and places that have collected this history, we have such a broad and rich collection of sources that there's a real opportunity here, not just for kind of pure scholarship, but for scholarship that actually is having impacts on things that are occurring in the future or decisions that are being made, whether it's in government, whether it's at institutions that still operate like Elwyn, other places like that. But I think just because of the nature of what's in Pennsylvania, both what occurred historically and the documentation that still exists, I think we have a real special opportunity that exists within Pennsylvania that could have really broader implications, much further outside the state as well.
Well, I think I'll summarize by saying not only a word of thanks, but also noting there's more to Pennsylvanian mid-Atlantic history than just Pennsylvania in the mid-Atlantic. And this topic gives us a taste of that and the possibilities for not just scholarship, but public advocacy. There's more to disability history in the past and in the present moment than just disability. Though we're talking about some 60 million people today who have some kind of disability. We're talking about 300 institutions across the country. The numbers give some validity to taking a broad approach to this, but there's more to Pennsylvania than Pennsylvania, and there's more to disability history than just disability history. So I thank all the contributors, and I particularly thank Tyler and Elliot, and I thank Linda and David and the PHA for making this opportunity available to us.
Yes, and thank you to all the participants. It's a fascinating discussion, both about the behind the scenes of the special issue, but also thinking about this very important subject. So with that, I thank all of the people in the audience, and thank you to the participants. And we'll bring this webinar to a close. Thank you.